Okay, there we go. Can you hear me okay? Okay. And
Can
you're
you
on.
hear me okay?
Yes. Sorry for the
Let me just make sure I'm on the right microphone. Yes, I am. Okay.
no problem. We have 4
And
people in
let
the
me
waiting
get
room. Let me
my,
just send them a message to say that we'll let them in shortly so I can coordinate with you.
okay, and let me get my screen. Are you going to be doing any housekeeping or anything up front that you need
Yeah.
to screen share? I can go ahead and share.
I don't need to
You
screen
will be?
share.
Okay.
I just have like 20 seconds of stuff to say. And
Then I'll go ahead and share my screen then.
Yes.
Okay.
And on my end, your virtual background is flipped.
It's flipped? Hold on.
Yeah, like,
what?
okay.
No, I can't see it. Hold on. Weird. It's not flipped on my end.
Maybe it needs to be mirrored.
You know what?
I don't know. It looks.
I don't know. Hold on. Because when I switch it, it's then backwards to me. It's weird. You know what? We can disable it because that's fine.
Okay.
I do not mind. All right, let me get back to
Okay.
clearing my screen so there's nothing behind to pop up. Okay.
We have 4 people in the waiting room, so it'll be intimate group here.
Alrighty. And can you see the slides?
I do. That looks great.
Okay.
And then let me double check you how to pronounce your name. Is it Sudi?
Mm-hmm.
Whalen?
Yep.
Okay. Doctor, right?
No, MED. Not yet. I'm a doctoral candidate. Give me time to finish.
Oh, good. Where are you in school?
I'm currently going through St. Mary's.
Oh, wonderful. I went to UCLA for the EDD.
Oh, awesome.
Okay, so you're going to screen share. I'm basically just going to tell them that they can, do reactions and engage in the chat and things like that.
Okay.
And I think I'll just let them in now because we're a little bit behind.
Sounds
You ready?
Good. Yep.
Okay. Admit all. Welcome. Let's see. Okay. Welcome to the session. Sorry, we had a little bit of technical difficulties, but I think we are here now. Okay, so we're going to get started. Before I turn it over to our presenter, this is for the session, A New Way, a book overview and application. My name is Mary Jo Pigo. I'll be the moderator for this session. Before I introduce our presenter, I have a few items to share with you. Please note that we're in a Zoom meeting and you have both video and audio microphone capability. We ask that you keep your microphone muted unless you're interacting in some way, for example, during Q&A. Please take your cues from the presenter and from me so that we can create a productive environment for all. If you have any questions or comments, please enter them into the chat box. As time allows, we'll share your questions with the presenter. And you also may use the chat feature to share thoughts with the presenter and or each other. You also have the ability, I believe, to post reactions, thumbs up, etc. on your video, and feel free to use those as appropriate. Thank you for being with us. We hope you enjoy the session. And it's now my pleasure to introduce our presenter, Sudi Whalen from the American Institutes for Research.
Thank you so much, Mary Jo. So I'm going to go ahead and jump in since we're a couple minutes behind. Thank you, Mary Jo, for helping us resolve that technical issue, by the way. Okay, so what we're going to talk about today is the book A New Way, which I have right here next to me. It's got little stickies and stuff all over it because I love this book. But it's all about how to add in faculty learning communities into your at your local college campuses and how to create learning communities that function, that work, and that are supported by data. And then by the time we get to the end of this session, I'm going to have a good surprise for all of you. So I'm Sudi Whalen. I'm with the American Institutes for Research. I've been working with professional learning communities, communities of practice, and just collaborative team building for quite a number of years. My background is in career technical education, in addition to equity, andragogy, adult learning theory, and faculty and not just faculty learning communities, but all collaborative teams. We're going to be talking about this specific book, A New Way, and it's called Introducing Higher Education to Professional Learning Communities at Work. I don't necessarily like using the phrase professional learning communities when we're talking about faculty learning communities, although that is the phrase used in here. And the reason for that is simply because faculty learning communities predate professional learning communities. They are around before PLCs were, and so but then somehow K-12 kind of adapted to becoming more collaborative and working in collaborative teams as a way of doing business. And somehow colleges got left behind in that. And so when Robert Eaker and Deborah Sells wrote this book, it's very much about pulling back in that collaborative culture that used to exist on college campuses that somehow fell by the wayside. But when we're talking about learning communities, whether you're using the phrase professional learning community or faculty learning community, we're talking about the same thing, except when we're talking about learning communities on college campuses, they don't quite function exactly. And there's a lot of reasons for that, primarily because of the way students learn differently versus being children as young adults and older adults, and then also in the way that college faculty interact with one another, just in the nature of your work. So let's talk about our focus today. We're going to look a little bit at the 3 big ideas of learning communities. We're going to talk about the culture shift needed. We're going to talk about collaborative teams and the culture of improvement. And then we're going to talk about intentional alignment for student success. And lastly, I have a surprise for all of you, like I mentioned later. So you all are going to be guaranteed the surprise. We'll see what happens for all the rest of the participants who are here and what Yara decides to do with that. Since there's only 4 of us, you're guaranteed to get that. So let's dive into the big ideas of essential learning. I really loved listening to Dr. Lowe talk a moment ago, because some of the things that she discussed are exactly the things that are talked about in this book and in that shift from isolation to working within a collaborative team. So what are those 3 big ideas? So I like to discuss, I like to talk, I like to chat. I'm a collaborative person. And so I'm going to ask you all to join me in conversation here. And I want to know what these things mean to you. You can enter your comments into the chat, or hi, Carol, or you can feel free to unmute, or if Mary doesn't mind unmuting you, raise your hand to unmute so that you can speak. So my first question for you is, what does it mean to you to have a focus on learning on your campus? What do you think that means for you when you just think about that phrase, focus on learning? How does that resonate in your mind as a big idea? What do you think that means? And you can put it in the chat, or feel free to raise your hand. We'll unmute and you can share and speak. But please don't leave me talking to myself. Anyone? Student learning, Carol said, yeah. Rebecca, go ahead.
I think it's a focus more on, what students are learning and taking away, sort of, it is the SLO symposium outcomes, over just grading and, compliance issues and things like that. I think we can lose sight of that sometimes, where it's checking the boxes and, fulfilling requirements and that. And to me, the focus on learning is more, I'm an idealist about education, learning for learning's sake, making a better world by learning, all of that good stuff. So that's what it means to me.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Rebecca. And you just gave so many spoilers for what's coming up later in this presentation. I see that Stephen said, I think it's the shift of focus on students in classroom. Yes. And then Alan said, students are not the only learners. Everyone learns, faculty, staff, admin, etc. Alan is also spoiling what's coming up in my presentation. Alan, did you want to add anything to that? And thank you for joining us on camera. Carol, did you have something you wanted to say?
Yeah, I do. So when you're going into a classroom, rather than observing the teacher and what the teacher is doing, looking more at what the students are doing and how are they learning, what are they learning. So that would
looking for those little indicators of student learning and success, and looking for, are they engaged? Are they picking it up? What's happening there? I love that. Thank you, Carol, for sharing that. And thank you, Stephen, for joining us on camera. So our next big idea is a focus on collaboration. What does that mean to you when you think about that? Does that seem like something different than what you currently do? Does it feel like kind of a culture or mindset shift? What does that make you think of when you think of a focus on collaboration? No worries, Rebecca, no worries.
It makes me think of generating ideas together, just like how you're pulling us out to contribute instead of just talking at us, that we're going to create this knowledge together.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. It means we're thinking through these things together, focusing on formative assessments during collegial conversations. Yes, I'm going to be talking about that later on today too, Carol, this afternoon. But yeah, exactly. We're thinking about what are the assessments? What are the data? What is the evidence, right? All those things. And we're not just saying, I know what's best for all of your students or anything like that. We're saying that the 6 of us as a team together can put our minds together and identify what is it specifically we need our students to learn, and how will we know that they've learned it, and what kind of data do we need to have to support that, right? So thank you so much for sharing. So my last question on this one is, when we think about a focus on results, what does that mean for you? And then Stephen said, working in committees right now, they often work in silos, often on related items. Collaborating more means breaking down those silos and working more fluidly as a team. Yes, Stephen, absolutely. I agree. We're going to talk about that too. It's like, did you guys read the book already? Like, is this why I only have everybody's read this? So what does that mean when we say focusing on results? What kind of results? And what does that mean for us when we think about it? What are we looking for? Student outcomes? Yeah, definitely. I mean, we are at the SLO symposium virtually after all. Students leave with skills and knowledge. Absolutely, Rebecca. Using results, using outcomes, metrics to assess those outcomes improvements. Absolutely, Stephen. Great. So when we talk about that first big idea, right, the focus on learning, the core focus of the learning community is learning, right? But we're not just talking about only us learning or just the student learning, right? We're talking about a shift of a literal culture shift from focusing on teaching and just making sure we're delivering the information to focusing on a culture of learning. I like the phrase from the, it was a basketball coach from North Carolina. He used to say, he actually has a book that says, you haven't taught until they've learned, right? And so we're thinking about that culture of learning. And so when we think about that, that's learning for students, it's learning for faculty, and learning for the institution as a whole, like I think Stephen or Alan mentioned earlier. So in the book, one of the things that Eaker and Sells say is the goal is that each graduating class learns more than the previous graduating class. In other words, we envision the institution itself as a learner. Over time, it continuously learns how to produce more learning with each graduating class. That makes sense, right? Because as we're continuously improving, of course, our student outcomes will improve over time. And so then our students themselves end up being better and having more opportunities as a result of that. Any questions on that before I move on to the next big idea? Nope. Okay. Alrighty, so our second one is capturing that culture of collaboration, right? It's that structure of embedded collaboration, faculty-led and student-focused. And when I say faculty-led, that's not to say administration's not involved, they're not included. We're going to get to that in a minute. But it means that the faculty has to be the ones who are leading the investigation, the discovery, even the experimentation to understand what students need, because they are the ones working directly with the students, right? But it has to be student focused. It's not necessarily what makes me as an educator comfortable and what makes me as an educator happy, but about what makes me as an educator best serve my student. And so a lot of times collaborating with my peers helps pull that greatness out, right? I might be an amazing educator, but I might go talk to Stephen, Alan, Karen, Rebecca, and Mary Jo and have a conversation and find out there's some really cool stuff I could be doing in addition to what I already do, right? So the other piece there is that the teams have shared responsibility for student success, but that also means that when students aren't doing well, we have shared responsibility for figuring out why. And the last piece here is that team members learn from one another and continuously build each other up. The goal of the faculty learning community is not to come together, point fingers and say, I did it this way and you need to do it the way I'm doing it because I know it works, because I know my students. No, it's to leave our egos at the door, come together and prepare to learn from each other. And that, while seemingly a very simple thing, can be very complex and requires a lot of time to team build, get to know people, really understand who you're working with, develop norms and things of that nature, just regular, normal collaborative practices that help bring people together so you can set the stage to actually have those collaborative conversations. Any questions about that before we move on to the focus on results? So our third big idea is a focus on results. Now, I know this is going to sound, not the greatest thing in the world, but it's the truth. The happiness of faculty simply isn't the primary focus. I know that's, as educators, we want our goals and our needs to come first, but we're educators, right? Our whole purpose in our career is to work with students, right? Although research tells us that collaborative teams make happier and more motivated and functional faculty, it's simply not the primary focus of learning communities. Instead, the focus is on the results of student learning. The paradigm shift from intention to results, which means I'm intending my students to learn this versus I'm looking to make sure they are, right? We're not just talking about what our students learn, but looking for evidence of learning and asking ourselves, what was the result? Where is the evidence, right? While we do need to identify what our students learn as part of a learning community, I'm not saying throw your outcomes out the window. Of course, we have to identify what we want them to learn. We have to identify the expected outcome. We also have to identify how we know that the student learned it and then respond when they don't learn it. That is the primary focus. How do we know they learned it and how am I going to respond if they don't? Teams set meaningful improvement goals when they're part of a learning community as part of this point towards results, right? Even if your teams are already amazing, like, are you great? Of course you're great. Are your students great? Yeah, you have awesome students. You're all awesome. That's why we're here today, right? Because we want to be even more awesome. And that's great. But nonetheless, there's always, always, always room for improvement. And there's room for growth. No matter how great we are, no matter how wonderful our data looks, no matter how many outcomes we're hitting, remember, we want the next graduating class to do better, right? And so the focus is on student learning, and we want that class to do better. And so we have to look at what did the previous graduating class do, even if it was awesome, even if it was great, and then say, okay, how do we improve upon that? How do we make that even better? Or if we said, okay, they did really great in this area, but there's a little area of improvement right over here, well, that's what we turn our new goal to since we've mastered this piece over here. Does that make sense? And then lastly, team members have, again, shared responsibility and they hold each other accountable for the success of all of our students, not just, I'm not only looking at my class and hoping my students succeed, but as a group, we're hoping all of our students succeed. Or as the old saying goes, a rise in tides lifts all boats, right? So we want to make sure everybody is doing a really good job. So any questions about those big ideas before we move into culture shift? Because I'm about to say some really sketchy, challenging stuff that's going to make you be like, I don't know, Sudie, are you ready? Are you prepared? Okay, here we go. Yeah, you agreed to this. All right, so are we really putting students first? We often say that we place the needs of the students first and foremost. Nothing trumps student learning and success, but is that true? So here's my question to you. I want you to take a moment and think about the American university and college culture as you know it in general terms. Don't think about just your campus, but just college culture, right? And I want you to really think about this question that's posed in the book. When it's autonomy, or both, of faculty and staff, which do university leaders opt to satisfy? The student need or the faculty and staff autonomy? What do you think? What are your thoughts? And you can raise your hand and unmute if you'd like, if you want to just speak, or you can type into the chat, either one.
The example that popped into my head was scheduling. Do we schedule for when faculty want to teach, or
Oh, Rebecca, you mind reader.
When students want to take them? And also, I think we've had this conversation on our campus about faculty developing classes that they want to teach, not necessarily that are what the students need to be taking.
Very good. Thank you, Rebecca. You hit the nail on the head with that one. Anybody else have any thoughts? Mary Jo, I saw you unmuted. Go ahead.
The Rebecca prompted me to think about like the guided pathways work that we're all engaging in and how important it is to have student voice in that conversation. I remember I was at a guided pathways conference and the idea about which courses to offer came up, and a student was talking about challenging faculty to think about, are you teaching that class because I need it or because you just like to teach it?
Right. Right.
And I think hearing directly from the students was just so powerful.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Mary Jo. Alan said in the chat, I think faculty, generalizing here, tend to value both student learning and their autonomy, but it seems teacher autonomy is more important. Yeah, I don't think there's any faculty member who doesn't care about student learning, but when it comes to that push comes to shove, which one are we going to satisfy? A lot of times it's simply easier to address what makes faculty more comfortable than it is to address making systemic change to support student learning, right? Alrighty, so I want you to think a little bit further now about the next question, which Rebecca kind of spoiled for us. But I want you to think about this next question. How do academic departments determine offerings and class schedules? And Mary Jo and Rebecca already kind of hit on this a little bit. But how, as in general terms, do you think faculty typically identifies scheduling and class offerings? Is it based on student need, or is it typically based on faculty autonomy and happiness? What do you think? I think Rebecca and Mary Jo kind of answered this, but I want to give Carol, Alan, and Stephen a chance to respond. And again, feel free to unmute if you'd like to speak. I'd love hearing from you. Stephen said, I think at our school, it's also often based on faculty desires. And you know what, Stephen, what you're saying totally aligns with what they found. This is what Eaker and Sells found. Rather than focusing on creating schedules and times based on student need, they often opt to build schedules around what the faculty member desires. And it was not always the case, but it was in most cases, right? And so you guys totally nailed that. That's when we think about college culture, we just kind of know when it comes to what happens, faculty autonomy and academic freedom tend to take priority. But when we talk about faculty learning communities, we're not talking about removing academic freedom. We're talking about marrying academic freedom and autonomy with student needs and equity and putting those two things together. And so we're not talking about, you know, saying one doesn't matter and the other one doesn't matter, but we're saying those two things have to come together. And when push comes to shove, the priority should be student needs and learning. So this is what Eaker and Sells found. They said that we have to move beyond, they said that we have to move beyond Darwinian survival of the fittest culture to one of in which every student is given the time and assistance that they need to succeed. Dr. Lowe literally just told us exactly that as well, right? We have to move away from, you know, making sure that, you know, we make it really challenging and really rigorous and really hard. And if you don't get it, that's just too bad. You should have stuck it in there. You should have tried harder. You should have studied longer, right? We want to get away from that to a point where we identify where was the gap, how could we better support the students and make sure that they learn. I will go so far as to add, though, we must do this without reducing rigor. The point isn't to lower standards or make SLOs easier for students to achieve, but to become a more equitable system that holds all students to the same high standards while also providing what they need to succeed. So we're not saying, you know, dumb it down, make it simpler so everybody passes. No, that's not equity. That doesn't help anyone. If we look at situations in which we say, you know, the students of color are struggling in this institution, what do we do? And then they lower those standards. What then happens? Nothing, because we haven't supported anyone. We end up with less prepared students as a result. So we have to hold all students up to the same high standards. Where does that Darwinian assumption come from? You know what, Alan? It predates me. But realistically speaking, when we look at the history of colleges and universities, they've always been very competitive, and it's always been, you know, an area where we can have accolades and say, I went to XY school and I graduated from here, and it's very competitive. And we want our kids to go to competitive schools. We want them to be on the higher tracks and all that stuff. That is the way the culture of education has become. And sadly, it's up to us on the ground level who are working with students and working with teachers to try to remove that and try to move it more towards an equitable learning environment where it's no longer Darwinian, but it's we support our students where and we meet them where they are. So yeah, I don't know where that comes from. I've done a lot of research on faculty learning communities, professional learning communities, and collaborative teams, but I have not dug into why colleges became Darwinian. I feel like they kind of have always been that way, just haven't evolved, honestly.
There's another great book called Grading for Equity by Joe Feldman, and he talks about the history of education and how it really was meant to track students and you know, and it was meant to produce workers, and it's a really good reflection of how we got where we are. And it's a great book in general, but it does have that section of things I didn't really think about, you know, what the history and original intent was of how education was set up.
Thank you, Rebecca. Can you put the title of the book in the chat so we can refer back to it if we need to? I appreciate that. So yeah, and when we think about, I can tell you a lot about the history of adult education in this country, and in the history of adult education, we talk about when we think about Lindman, Rosenstock Hussey, when we think about Malcolm Knowles, when we think about all these programs, they were all work-based programs back then, but they were all about getting students jobs, right? But then when you look at how colleges evolved, it wasn't quite the same, and so it's really interesting to see how like the college competitiveness versus the getting into the workforce piece never didn't seem to quite marry each other. But now in 2021, we're being asked to make sure students are ready for work, that they're ready academically, that they have all the things that they have, and that they have the technological skills they need to succeed. It's a lot of pressure sometimes, right? Thank you, Rebecca, for sharing that grading for equity, what it is, why it matters, and how it can be transformed schools and classrooms. I'll definitely be checking that out. So let's get further into this culture shift conversation. So when we're talking about the culture shift of the faculty learning community, we're talking about going from isolation to collaboration, right? And I think Alan mentioned earlier about all the committees, and at the state level, I was in a meeting last week where we were talking about various communities of practice that are going on all over the state. And it was interesting to me that we have all these different conversations happening about the same topics, but no one's talking to each other. And I was like, well, how come non-credit and credit aren't talking about the same thing? Because don't you both have that? And they're like, well, we'd love to bring them to the table, but we can't figure out how to break down that silo. And my thing is, walk across your campuses, talk to the people on the other side of the campus, be intentional with trying to create these collaborative teams, right? But of course, you want to start out within your department teams, within your class alike and shared alike groups, right? And so the whole goal here, from starting on a granular level to support student success, is putting teachers who teach the same thing together, just to make sure that they have alignment. And then you can make that broader as you go forward. The next piece is going from an individual clarifying what students must learn to a collaborative team establishing essential learning. That just means that we're coming together and we're saying, this is what we think this outcome is, and this is what I think it means to meet that outcome. And when we put those two things together, this is what it's going to look like when we know that there's been success. So it's not just me saying to the rest of the team, this is our expected outcome. Instead, it's us coming together, holding hands and agreeing on what that outcome should be. Another shift we have is going from individuals attempting to discover ways to improve to collaborative teams helping each other improve. Because when we help one another improve, we all build up together, we all grow together, we all become better together. But the thing is, you might see something that I don't see, and I might see something that you don't see. And there's going to always be pieces and elements of things that we can learn from one another. And so instead of me trying to figure out how I can improve all by myself, I can work with my collaborative team and we can all learn together. And then we all improve and from learning from one another. We also go from the privatization of practice to the open sharing of practice. And I know that's not normal on college campuses in a lot of cases, but that's what I'm advocating that you do, is instead of being so close guarded to what's happening in your class and what you want to do, sharing that with other people. Because if you're doing something really great that's really working, then you should be sharing that with someone else so that they can learn from you and do the really great and really working thing also. And then we go from decisions made on the basis of individual preference. This is what I want. This is what makes me happy. This is what meets my needs, to decisions made collectively by building shared knowledge and best practice. Now, that's not to mean every single decision that a faculty member makes for their class has to be collaboratively decided. That is not what I'm saying. That would take away academic freedom and autonomy, and we don't want to do that. But what I mean is we're agreeing on what those outcomes are. We come together to peer review what we're going to be doing, whether it's lesson charrettes, we're sharing data, whatever, and then we're sharing what we plan to do and we're accepting a feedback. That doesn't mean that I'm going to teach something specifically because Alan told me to. It means that I'm going to come to Alan to share what I'm intending to teach. Alan's going to give me feedback. I can choose to make adjustments based on Alan's feedback to improve my lessons. And then we go back and forth. And then I do the same for Alan. He shares his lesson and then I can give him feedback. He can apply that. And then it's even better in the end, right? And then at the same time, by doing this, we can identify if there's gaps in our instruction, if there's something that Alan is covering, because we teach the same class, don't forget, that Alan is covering that I want to start covering, that I'm not covering, right? And I could say, oh, Alan's hitting that, and that's really going to help hit that outcome. Maybe I need to include something like that in my lesson. And so it makes us have to collaboratively look at building that shared knowledge and understanding. Sylvie said, adding colleagues who teach the same course on our Canvas shell has helped our department be more transparent and collaborative. That's awesome. Thank you, Sylvie, for sharing. And then when we look at going from, this is a hard, I'm going to be very honest with you. When I was first beginning working in a learning community, this last one was the hardest for me. Going from the assumption that these are my students to the assumption that these are our students. I had to trust that my teammates cared just as much about my students and their success as I did. And that's what I had a hard time with, because sometimes we'd be looking at the data and I would get defensive and I'd say, well, no, this student has a child. They can't come to class on Thursday nights because they don't have childcare. There's a reason why their scores are the way that they are. But then when we start digging deeper and removing that defensiveness, we were able to figure out where we need to resolve issues. In our case, some of those issues resulted in changes to our attendance policy so that we could allow for blended learning, so that our students didn't have to be physically in the seat in order to still submit assignments and keep up with class. These are small little tiny things that affect equity, that affect students' ability to succeed. We also made changes in the way we delivered our class curriculum. We made changes to what our expected outcomes were and identifying what were those essential standards for us. And so for me, and other people might have more difficulty with the other items, but for me, these are our students, because I very much cared about my students and I was very close with my students, and I was just having a hard time trusting that anybody else cared too. But the fact was, after about 6 months to a year, it was very clear that we had all taken ownership of each other's students, because we were no longer looking at just individual class data. We were looking at how was our whole department doing as a whole, and how are we moving the whole department forward. And it was me, the tech teacher, talking to the woodworking teacher about how we can move the woodworking class forward and making sure they can pass their written exams and things like that. We had nothing in common in terms of what we taught other than math and language, right? So there's just so many things to think about, but there's a certain level of trust that is required to do all of these things in terms of that culture shift. And so that's why I do want to again repeat that team building and trust building is necessary for this to be successful. Now, I do have a question for you all, because I've been talking for a while. Which of the items above stand out the most to you, and why? And even if it's something that's challenging or something you're most excited to try to address, which of these do you think stands out the most to you? And again, you can unmute and share if you would like.
Hi, yeah. I think this is Stephen. I think the last one kind of stands out to me because we've been talking about implementing guided pathways in our institution a lot. So there's been a lot more focus on the students going through it as a group, as cohorts, rather than individual courses, and focus on the programs more than so one of the things that's been kind of pushed, like I said at our meetings, especially our learning outcomes meetings, is students, because students take programs and not courses. They take groups of courses essentially. And so we want to shift our attention from looking at individual course learning outcomes to focusing on analysis of program outcomes and how students are moving through programs. Yeah. So that was my piece.
Thank you for sharing, Stephen. Yes, absolutely. That is moving from, and it does kind of go together. When we think about that last one, that open sharing of practice and things like that, it does kind of all go together, and it is a significant shift. And when you are implementing all these new initiatives, having to wrap your head around that can be a little overwhelming. In the chat, we did have some comments here. Carol said feedback that impacts and improves results. Rebecca said open sharing, and Sylvie agreed, open sharing. Thank you all so much for sharing that. So then let's think about leading culture change. There's no one size fits all approach. I regret to inform you, that's just not a thing. When it comes to leading culture change on your campus, it really depends on the specific needs of your students and your staff and where you currently are in terms of collaboration. From the colleges that I have spoken with across the state, some are doing some amazing stuff in terms of faculty learning communities They already got this stuff going on. But then some are like, we just don't collaborate. Like I go to my class and I don't see anyone else except for the occasional department meeting. And some people don't even have to go to that. So, there's not a one size fits all approach because it really depends on what's happening at your campus. But effective leadership is absolutely required. In the book, Eaker and Sells say it's unreasonable to think that culture change in any organization will simply bubble up from the bottom. One of the greatest ironies of organization life is that the quality of bottom-up strategies and innovation depend on the quality of top-down direction and leadership. What that means is teachers cannot be empowered to do what they need to do if they don't have good leadership coming from the top. And so that's why it requires what we call the simultaneously loose and tight approach to leadership. And they have an entire chapter talking about that. But you have to be loose enough to allow faculty to lead the direction of their teams, maintain their academic freedom. But you have to be tight enough to envision values and commitments, while also being loose on approach and tight on results. So it's a balance here when it comes to distributive leadership. You have to enable and allow faculty to do what they need to do while not letting them completely run amok and move away from what the overall institutional vision is, right? So when we talk about the top-down, bottom-up leadership, we're talking about the top-down being that you need to articulate with clarity what the core mission is and hold faculty and staff accountable for making sure they're aligning with that mission. It also means being explicit about what priorities are in which that are expected to guide decision making. If faculty doesn't know of these priorities, if they don't know what the mission, vision, and commitments are, if that's not being relayed to them, they can't adequately plan to help meet that mission, vision, or commitment for that. But then there also have to be some bottom-up happening here too. Improvements simply do not work without the buy-in of those implementing changes. If we're asking faculty to develop learning communities to come together to improve student learning outcomes, they have to be allowed to do that, but they have to buy into the process too. And that's why I really want to hone in on it needs to be faculty-led. Yes, leadership needs to oversee and support, but the faculty has to lead it. They have to be the ones to buy into it. They have to be the ones to develop it and make it grow. And then faculty has to be empowered to investigate, learn, and experiment. As leaders, we cannot expect our faculty to just go run through and do all of this stuff and magically see students' changes and success overnight. This is one of the things that we run into a lot when I run a professional learning communities institute. And one of the things that we run into is we'll be having, teams are doing great, faculty's excited, administrators like, well, I'm not seeing any changes in results and it's been 6 weeks. That's not how life works. Change is not that fast. And so we need to give faculty room and empower them to do the investigative work needed to identify what the goals should be, to take the time to learn from one another and to experiment and try new things to try to improve student outcomes. Steve said since COVID, we've been sharing practices more since faculty have had to learn how to conduct remote classes. So regular PD has been made to help faculty sharing practices. That's awesome. That is literally awesome. One of the case studies I'm going to be sharing in my next session is actually about faculty learning community that was developed specifically because they were struggling with online learning. And this was pre-COVID, but with COVID, everybody was struggling to try to do this all at the same time, right? But thank you for sharing that, Stephen. So let's talk about collaborative teams and the culture of change. So when we talk about collaborative teams and learning communities, there are 4 key questions. When we talk about them on the college campus, we say, what are the essential knowledge, concepts, skills that we want students to be able to demonstrate in each major and in each course? Or what do we want our students to learn? We say, how will we know if students are learning, or how do we know when they've learned it? How can we provide additional time and support to students who experience difficulty? What do we do if they don't learn it, is a way of saying that simply. And then lastly, and this is one that often gets left off because when students are doing well, our first inclination is to pair them up with someone who isn't and help the other person. And that doesn't always, it's a great practice. Teaching people is always a good way to learn, but it doesn't always benefit the student who's very advanced. So the next one is, how can we extend learning of students who demonstrate proficiency? How do we build upon their learning? In other words, what do we do if they don't know it, right? And so we're asking these 4 things. What do I want my students to learn? How do I know if they've learned it? What do we do if they don't learn it? And what do we do if they already know it, right? Those are our 4 key questions here. And then we have to move into goal setting together. We have to investigate, utilize available data to determine initial goals and find those gaps, right? We identify what additional data is needed and how to go about retrieving it. Is there a specific data person you have to ask? Do you have access to the data you need? Do you even know what data you need, right? These are conversations we have to have. One of the things, the best things for a community that's new to do is come together and bring all the data that they have and say, okay, this is what's available to me. And then when you look through that, that helps you identify questions that you don't have answers to. So if you're looking through and you're saying, okay, but I'm seeing students are having a hard time here, but I'm not seeing where we're assessing them for that. Is that on another assessment? Is that on another piece of data? Then we know we have a question that we need to go back and answer. We also identify what additional data is needed and how to go. I said that already. We set goals. Goal setting is huge, but not just long-term goals. We set short-term goals to help us meet the long-term goals. And a really, really big thing that people often overlook, but is huge in terms of learning community motivation, is celebrating. You have to celebrate every win, no matter how small, because the work of a learning community can take a lot of time. It's a lot of effort to change all of these things. So when you have even the smallest bit of success, you need to acknowledge it, give them an opportunity to celebrate it. I'm not talking about have a huge party and a rager every time somebody graduates, but I mean, like, you know, acknowledge it, send an email, congratulations, I noticed our test scores improved by 3%. You know, CC the dean, point out when these bright spots are happening so people can feel good about it, because that's what keeps us motivated to continue doing this work. When we do all the, and this work is not easy. Dr. Loven acknowledged it earlier. This is hard work. We have to dig in and we have to do this, right? But the thing is, it's much easier to continue doing that hard work when you feel acknowledged, you feel seen, and you feel appreciated. So you have to celebrate those small wins to keep the team going. Rager, I've never heard that word being used. I'm not going to talk about that right now. Sure, Alan. Maybe not in a professional setting, but so then we talk about when we're setting our goals, what is our overarching process here, right? The goal is to have a data-driven continuous improvement process where we first analyze and collaboratively collect and analyze data. We identify our areas of strength and future focus. We establish goals. We participate in collective inquiry, which means we're seeking out best practices. This is basically an ongoing action research project, if we're being honest. We establish tasks, activities, responsibilities, timelines, and resources needed for us to meet our goals. We then implement process, carry out action research, conduct formative monitoring, and adjust as needed. And then lastly, we monitor results, and then we repeat the process. This is not a one and done situation. We don't do it one time and we say, okay, we saw a little bit of growth, so we're good. We don't have to do anything else. The students are awesome. No, because remember, we want the next graduating class to do even better. So once we do that and we see some success, we go back and look at what else can we do, right? And we continue moving forward that way. When we're thinking about student improvement and we're thinking about all of these things, the overall goal, again, is to have a cyclical process in which student learning is the central focus and is improved, if that makes sense. So collaborative planning, what happens when collaborative planning? So when it comes to collaborative planning, there are different elements that are needed to succeed. I'm going to go through what each of these really mean in a moment, but time for collaborative planning and professional development. Everybody is not going to immediately be a perfect collaborative team player. They may not understand what a learning community really is. They may not understand why we need to focus more on student learning or specific outcomes, you know, things of that nature. So there might be professional development needed there and areas of growth for us to learn together. We want to talk about the why, identification of what the major tasks are, assign responsibilities and timelines, identify the resources needed and ensure that the allocation of resources aligns to that, and then that top-down, bottom-up planning. So let's talk about these individually. So when we talk about time for collaborative planning and professional development, plans developed by leadership for the team will ultimately lead to a lack of commitment from some, if not all, team members. However, those leading development of learning communities can act as facilitators to help guide teams toward making plans themselves. So the goal is, like, for example, if you're an SLO coordinator, who I really encourage SLO coordinators to act as those initial facilitators on campuses as you're bringing the teams together. It's not your job to tell them this is what your goal is, this is what the plan is, this is what we're going to do, because that's not collaborative. That's the antithesis of collaboration. Instead, you can guide them towards identifying what they need, asking them, okay, what kind of data do you have? What kind of data do you need? Let's take a look at this together. Okay, what are we seeing here? What are the gaps here? Okay, how can we address these gaps? Asking them the guiding questions to get them to make these decisions for themselves. The plan should not ever be established by one person on the team and provided to everybody else. That's also not collaboration. If I develop the plan for all of us and then no one else is involved in the plan itself, what ends up happening? I end up demotivating the rest of my team, not including everybody, and somebody gets left off. So that's not necessarily fair, and then your team is no longer collaborating. So you want to make sure that whatever planning you come up with is developed together and that we all agree that this is what the plan is and these are what the steps are. The team needs time to plan together and learn together. That means they have to be given the time to do that. And most importantly, if you pay them, they will come, usually. If you're asking faculty to show up and collaborate and plan and do all this work and you're not paying them, don't be surprised if they don't show up for that meeting. I'm just saying. I know sometimes budgetary constraints and concerns are serious, and sometimes it's like, I don't have the money to pay all my adjunct faculty to do this. Okay, well, think about what funding you do have and who you can bring to the table so that you can do this work, right? Because if you're asking people, and there will be some people who are willing to do things for free. I was one of those. I'm like a PD omnivore. I'm going to show up at all the meetings. I'm going to do all the things. I want to learn all the stuff, right? But everybody's not like that. And so you cannot just expect everybody to come to work and work for free and do all this really heavy work. So, you know, if you can pay them, try to. And then up next is the why. Why do we do this? Constantly refer back to it. The simple phrase is pointed out in Eker and Sell's book, and this is how they framed it. Here's why we're doing this, here's why it's important, and here's what the data tells us. Therefore, we've collaboratively set these goals that, if accomplished, will have a positive impact in these data and help us become the kind of college we said we seek to become, right? And so that's a long phrase. You can rephrase that however you want, but ultimately you're going to say, our goal is student learning outcomes. We looked at this data. This is how we set up this collaborative goal. And we all agree we're going to do this, because there's going to be a point in which, and I'm just being honest, someone on the team is going to become frustrated. Someone on the team is going to feel like, oh, we've been doing this for so long. This is really hard. It's a lot of work. And that's where they need to be reminded, hey, we looked at that data. That data showed us there's a huge gap. We agreed that we didn't want students graduating next year to have the same issue. So we're tackling this together. Are you still committed to doing this work? Because normally when you point it out that way, people aren't going to be like, no, I don't care about student learning anymore. Like, who's going to say that? Nobody. Instead, they're going to be like, you know what, you're right. It's just sometimes it's frustrating. Sometimes it's hard. And you have to give people space to acknowledge it is hard work. You don't want to shoot people down when they say, this is really hard. I'm getting frustrated. I'm not sure what to do. Instead, you ask them, what do they need? How can I help you? How can I assist? Let's get through this together. Just acknowledge that it's okay to feel overwhelmed sometimes. It's going to sometimes feel frustrating, but we have to work together and we have to move forward together. You don't want to leave anybody behind or make them feel belittled because they felt frustrated or because they felt overwhelmed. Identifying identification of major tasks. You want to identify the specific steps needed to accomplish the goal. A lot of times we set goals and then we don't think about how we have to get, what we have to do to get to that goal. And then we act surprised when we can't meet the goal. So when you're setting the goal, you want to think about, okay, my goal is to increase student learning outcomes by 10%. What do I need to do to increase student outcomes by 10%? Does that mean I need to provide additional tutoring time? Does that mean I need to provide additional feedback and support? Does that mean I need to increase the level of access my students have to me in terms of office hours so I can support them? What does that mean? And so we need to identify the specific steps, right? How we're going to get there. We also want to assign responsibilities. Each specific task needs to be assigned to a person, and it should not be one individual being solely responsible for accomplishing the goal. That's not collaboration. We don't want to see Mary Jo's name on the whole timeline and she's the only one doing anything, but the whole team gets to take credit. Because what's going to happen? Mary Jo's going to be annoyed that she gets stuck doing everything. She'll probably do it, but she's going to talk about y'all later behind your backs. And then next year, she's going to be like, I don't want to be on the faculty learning community anymore. Not just kidding. Mary Jo would never act like that. But the fact is that people feel resentful when they get tasked to do everything. Even people like me who are always quick to sign up for stuff, when I start realizing my team's not supporting me anymore, I feel frustrated and I feel left out and I feel like I'm stuck doing all of this, right? So you want to make sure that the whole team is involved in meeting the goal and that whatever the tasks are assigned to multiple individuals and that they're giving chances to work together. You also want to identify the goal timeline and include expected completion of each task. So if I'm saying by the end of next year, I'm increasing learning outcomes by 10%, then I need to be able to identify at what points am I doing the tasks it takes to get there? What are my checkpoints? And I'm also looking at, am I meeting my goal in between time? Because if I'm giving myself a whole year, there's got to be points at which I'm saying, okay, it's been 2 months. Are we seeing any increase? It's been 6 months. Have we seen any increase? It's 9 months. Have we seen any increase? And because I'm checking all the way along the line. I'm not going to wait until the whole year has ended to see where we are and then be disappointed because nothing happened. Because again, we identified those steps and tasks that we needed. We said who was going to do it. And then we created a timeline so we have moments so we can come in and check and see what we're doing. This one's really important. Identification of resources. You want to identify the resources you need to accomplish your goal and work with leadership to acquire said resources. However, you have to be understanding that budgetary constraints might require your team to wait or choose a less expensive option or alternative, right? So we have to, and this is where that top-down, bottom-up piece comes. We need, but they have to be able to inform us what we can actually feasibly do or what we can afford to do. So for example, if the thing that's going to increase student learning outcomes is related to technology, but we don't have the funding to purchase that new technology, then the question becomes, well, can we do it next year? Or how can we go about getting the funding? Is there a grant available? And it's also helpful to do the research related to that. If you're saying you want something and saying, going to your dean and saying, hey, there's a grant available for this tech and we really think it'll help outcomes, is way more likely to get a yes than, hey, I need about $50,000 to $60,000 so I can improve outcomes if you buy me this tech. Right. So, do the research and see what's out there if you can. And then we talk about the top down, bottom up planning, right? In terms of faculty needs to assure goals and plans align with the overarching institutional mission, vision, values, and commitments. We want to assure the goal planning is geared toward student learning. Now, it's always easy to talk about, all of our different plans that we have, and I'm actually going to talk a little about that in my case studies one later in terms of a school who set their plan and they did all this stuff, but there was no evidence of student learning. Everything was, they produced peer-reviewed papers, they did all this stuff, and their resumes got built up. But what's happening with the student learning? So you want to make sure that's the central focus. You want to also communicate the team's needs to leaders in order for them to support the plan. If we're not communicating with them, how can they support it? On the leadership side, though, you want to ensure goals and plans align to overarching institutional mission, vision, values, and commitment. Notice I put that on both sides. It's not just up to leadership to assure this is happening. It's between leadership and faculty to both agree that we're going to make sure that all of our goals and plans align to these things. So it falls in both categories. We also want leaders to work with faculty and staff to assure that they understand and can support the goals and plans. So if the leader's looking at something and they're not understanding how the request is going to support student learning, then that's when we need to have a conversation and talk about it, right? And so it's up to the leadership to make sure that they're staying involved, that they're asking questions, and they're staying up to speed on what's happening and what the needs are. And then leadership should also communicate if there's a lack of resources that will hinder the plan. If Stephen sent a plan to me and said, hey, this is my plan, so what we're going to do, and I need X amount of dollars to do this, and I sent it back, I said, looks great, Stephen, knowing full well we don't have the resources and not telling him that, Stephen's going to think he can go forward with that plan, right? And so sometimes it is easy to say that plan looks great, we'll see what we can do, and not follow up. But if we know up front we don't have the funding to support it, then I need to come back to Stephen and be like, this looks great. Unfortunately, we don't have the plan, we don't have the funding to do this software right now. Is there a different alternative we can use, or can we pause this, put a pin in this until next year and focus on something else? So that seems like such simple communication, but that's where communication breakdowns happen when we don't want to say no, and we want to support everything. We don't want to say no, so we just say, okay, sounds great, good luck with that, and then people end up flailing and trying to figure out why something isn't working. So communication has to go both ways. All right, so I'm running out of time. So before I get to my surprise, does anybody have any questions?
I have a quick question that maybe you
Sure,
want to
as long
answer.
as it's
maybe
not about, hopefully it's not about Ragers, but yes, go ahead.
No. A few years ago, I got involved in something that was like a professional learning community with a couple of colleagues. And it was very rewarding. And in part, that was because we met at a conference and we started talking about how excited we were to kind of engage in this work. When we went back to our campus a couple of years later after our experience and tried to kind of recreate it for other people, we found that very difficult because we weren't meeting people who are already excited about it. So I guess the kind of my comment / question is, like excitement in what you're doing seems to be a necessary part of making this work.
It kind of, sort of, but not really. So I ran into that too because I, like you, went to a training and I was like, oh my gosh, this is the coolest thing in collaboration. And I was like, I can't wait to do this. And I was so excited. And my team was not, right? And so for a moment, it kind of stalled and I felt very discouraged. But then when I started thinking about why I wanted to do this, it wasn't because I just wanted to hang out with my teammates, my colleagues. It was because I really wanted to see student learning improve. And so when I came back to my team and I said, look, we don't have to do it this way, but I feel like we should really collaborate so that we can all improve our student outcomes. And I was like, can we just like talk about it? Can we meet more, whatever? And so as we started meeting, I realized that part of our problem is that we were all a bunch of know-it-alls who didn't know each other personally that well. And I don't mean that to be funny. Like, we were all a bunch of people with high-level degrees who just thought we were we were hired for being experts in our field. We're all career technical education teachers, right? So we know what's best in our field, which doesn't make us the best teachers, right? And so when we came together, what I realized is that we had to focus on team building. So we literally spent, and Carol knows this story because she's known me for a while, we literally spent 6 months solely focusing on team building. And once we got our team wanting to come together and collaborate, getting them to collaborate on student learning was much easier. So it was literally, in the beginning, it was like meeting once a month for an hour. We always had snacks. Literally, food was a norm because the timing of our meeting was when the daytime faculty was just getting done and the evening faculty was getting ready to start. And that was an in-between window and everybody was hangry. So we started feeding people. But we'd make sure like everybody come together, we'd have dinner, we'd talk, we'd play a game, we'd always do some kind of team building activity that was about education, though. It was very focused. And so we would get to know one another, get to know our backgrounds, get to know more about our classes and our students through that team building. And then it wasn't as hard to get them to focus on student learning, but you have to get them to want to come to the table. And the other piece about that is also, if you're a faculty member trying to pursue this, you have to bring leadership on board because and that leadership has to give you and empower you with the ability to pursue this. And so if it becomes a thing like Alan's just trying to implement this thing that Alan wants to do, people aren't going to be as excited about it. But when it comes to, hey, Alan has this great idea, I've talked to Alan about it, Alan and I would like to work with whoever wants to volunteer at first to be a part of this collaborative team so we can see if it improves, then we have a grassroots thing that starts up and is supported by leadership. Does that make sense, Alan? And what you're talking about is very common. That happens a lot. People get excited. They go to things like this and they go back to their campus and they're like, no one wants to play with me. I don't understand. So yeah, start with that team building and just bringing people together and then move the ball forward from there.
And my experience is in K-12. And so also building those teams, starting small, like maybe with one grade level. High school would be maybe just the English department. I believe one of the successful high schools started with English department, and then one year they did the science. And so it made it much more doable when the principal was working with his teams. So, it's hard to get that excitement going, but if you do smaller, it really helps.
Yeah, and then one of the things that I do want to say in terms of working with teams and administrator involvement is that it really depends on the team and the team's relationship with the administrator. Because like I know Carol and her staff and things like that, and before she whatever. Anyway, but the point is like they have a really great relationship with her. And so and it's not to say that administrators don't always have good relationships, but some administrators have more of a heavy hand and people are just more intimidated by them. And so them being in the room makes people feel as if they can't be free to say what they want to say. But then there's also administrators who them being in the room makes people feel like, oh, this is serious. We can actually do this work, right? And so you really want to gauge your team's relationship to that leadership and identify if that works. And it's always great that at that kickoff meeting when you first get it going to have the dean or administrator there to make sure that they're demonstrating that they support that. But whether or not they should be at your future meetings really depends on how comfortable the team is. I know when we were doing this, our administrator was there at first for all of our meetings, and then it got to the point that no one would talk when she was there, but the second she'd leave the room, everybody had so much to say. And so I basically was like, can you stop coming to the meetings? But she was very, very kind about it and was willing to do so. So yes, thank you for asking that question, Alan. That was a really good question. It's something a lot of people run into. So I'm glad you talked about that. So now time for my surprise. I have surprises. So there's only a few of you in here. We set this up so the first 31 people who complete this form get a free ebook copy of A New Way. So you
Oh
don't,
my goodness.
I know, so you don't have to buy it for yourself. So you can either scan it, or let me get the code for you and pop it into the chat, because I copied that this morning so I wouldn't forget. So you can scan that with your phone if you want to do it on your phone, or if you go to the chat, you can just follow the link here and you can fill the form out there. And so all you need to do is put in your name and your email address and agree that we're going to give Amazon your email to send you this book, and you can have this book for free. And then so I'll leave it up to Yark to figure out who he's going to give the remaining books for. But yeah, you can absolutely get this book for free. It's the ebook copy. We're not going to send you the hard copy, unfortunately, because then we have to collect your addresses and it's too much PII and we don't want to be responsible for that. So yeah, if you want to read the book and go through all of it, everything that I've covered in today's session is covered in the book and then some. There's a lot of great information in here. If you come from K-12 or have done PLCs in K-12, and then you're interested in learning how that is similar but different on a college campus, this is a great book to look at, or to read, not just look at, don't just look at the pages, but read it, to read, so that you can see where the differences really lie. And a lot of it has to do with just teacher autonomy and academic freedom, but there are some differences and there's a lot of similarities, but especially in terms of leadership, leading the teams, facilitating the teams, and making sure that the teams are moving along. It's a really, really, really great book. I like it. As you can tell, I've flagged it all over the place. I've written in it. I annotate. I write in my books. I'm sorry. I'm one of those people who cracks the spine. Alan approves. Thank you. So we are right at time, I think, but thank you so much for being here. Please make sure to claim your free copy of the book. I'm going to be sending Yark the email addresses and everything in the morning, so you should see them. We said within 10 business days to give us time, but he said he was planning on doing it on Saturday, so we'll see what happens. So thank you all so much for being here. It's been great collaborating with you in this past hour. Please don't forget to get your book, and have a great rest of the day. And thank you, Mary Jo.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sudie, for the presentation. I just have a quick housekeeping, just to let you know that we have a break for about 15 minutes. The next breakout sessions start at 11:30. Sudie's doing another breakout session. We encourage you to log in about 5 minutes early to be safe, and thank you for your patience. We're having some unexpected technical Zoom issues, but hang in there. Thank you for attending the session. I believe that there's going to be an evaluation that gets sent out at the end of the day, so keep an eye out for that, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Alrighty, I'm going to move to my next.
Okay.
I think I'm with you next too, right?
Yes, same. But so the issue is that, like, I don't, when we set up the Zooms, I'm outside of their organization. Like, I'm not a TCC confirmed person. So whoever has it has to jump on and start and then give us access.
Got
so
it.
She knows that there's an issue, and that's what's happening. But I'll see you there.
Sense. I'll see you there.